Dr. McKenna, what is top of mind for you?
Well, Sav, I was thinking about our recent podcast we did on becoming trustworthy, and boy, that really landed. It was based on that research that Arthur Satterwhite had brought to us from Young Life
Hmm.
about that 4 out of 10 young people are feel like they are not worthy of love, which goes deep fast, right? When we think about the young people around us, whether it's our children or other folks we know. But I hope people will listen to that podcast because the connection between that concept of our belovedness and and trustworthiness, and also its connection to efficacy, that belief that I could do something, that sense of myself, is so important. And I think it's one of the reasons there's this deep connection between leadership development and we can connect it all the way back to that sense of being loved. Like as we people don't often necessarily, some people might, but feel loved because we tell them they're loved. But they don't feel trustworthy because we tell them they're trustworthy. It's because there are certain things that get built up. And so something as simple as developing leader capacity and competence can give us a sense of our own worth. So it's just, I hope people will go check that out. It's where my brain was. I was thinking about that. I listened to the podcast and I thought, man, I hope people feel this, maybe even pass it to their children, you know?
Yeah,
So,
it was a rich conversation, and I've been hearing similar feedback. It's just opening up doors for conversations with um, teams and the next generation, that's coming up in their organizations. So it was so
yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Excited for this conversation. So let's get this wild conversation going. Welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to have a wild conversation with Daniel Edds. Dan has been practicing management consultant for over 25 years and has worked with over 250 organizations, helping them to improve business processes and maximize employee and customer value. He's the author of 2 books, and the research for his most recent book, Leveraging the Genetics of Leadership, Cracking the Code of Sustainable Team Performance, included organizations representing healthcare, manufacturing, small business, K 12 education, an NFL Super Bowl champion, and just for fun, the New York Mafia and the Salvation Army. And in September 2023, Dan was accepted into the first cohort of PhD researchers at the Birmingham Leadership Institute, University of Birmingham in UK. His research will focus on how systemic approach to organizational leadership builds cultures of patient safety. Dan, thank you for being with us today.
No, thanks for having me. Always fun to be here.
We are going to play a quick round of wild cards, and I know you're familiar with this. And so I chose 10 out of our deck of 50. Each card has a different question with a developmental focus. And we'll just pick a number between 1 and 10. I'll go first, and then Dan, you can go next, and Rob, you'll round us out. So today I'm going to choose number 4. Is your introversion or extroversion dependent upon the situation? I trend towards extroversion in general. However, depending on who's in the room, it it'll take me a little bit to move towards that full level of extroversion. So,
Okay, how about number 6?
what has allowed you to survive well during a tough day this last week?
The last week. Boy, what has allowed me to survive through a tough day this last week? Um,
Yes.
yeah, it sounds a bit trite and maybe a bit blasé, but reminding myself of a mission, why I'm doing what I'm doing. And yeah, it's hard, but there is a sense of calling to what I'm doing these days. Reminding myself of those things, I think, always gets me through a tough time.
mm,
Powerful.
yeah.
Thank you. Dr. McKenna,
I'm going to go with number 8.
what important thing is happening at the intersection of your life and work?
I would say one thing is both of my sons entering the workforce. And it's given me a front row seat to my aspiration for the development of leaders, because my hope for them is that they work for a great leader out of the gate, and so I feel that intersection happening all the time right now, because I'm hearing the stories of their one son's going to be entering the workforce in the fall, and one just grabbed a full-time job in the last couple of weeks. So that's what I feel like. I feel like there's a, you know what I mean? When that
Yeah,
experience of all the things you're trying to do and you realize, oh, this is going to have a direct impact on my child, whether someone is actually that amazing developing leader is. So
it's a different
that's,
level of intersection.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Love it.
Thank you, Sab, for that. Dan, it is just so good to have you on. And before we get into your story, I have to start with, I wanted to ask you a question, if you would share something that you and I have talked about before. For our listeners who don't know, my dad was a 3-time university professor, or sorry, college president, and professor at times. And Dan, you told me a story about my dad. My dad is now in his mid 90s, and he listens to the podcast. And I tell him, Dad, we wild leaders, oftentimes we run in your wake. Like, there's times where we feel this sense of, and it really does help him, because he doesn't always hear the stories as much anymore. And Dan, would you mention the story that you remember about my dad?
Well, actually, let me mention two. So I was at Seattle Pacific University when he was the president, and I still remember our ivy cutting ceremony and the story that he told. And the ivy cutting ceremony was everybody got a big string of ivy. We had to cut it off, and I don't know what we were supposed to do with it, but I took mine home and I planted it um, uh, on the fence line by where we lived. And I'm sure that whoever is living in that house today probably is still trying to pull that ivy up and get
Huh.
rid of it,
Uh-huh.
but they
Uh-huh.
can't get rid of it because that's what ivy does. Um, but he told a story of getting in a New York taxi and landing at the airport, getting in a taxi, and he told the story of getting in that thing and realizing it was clean, spotlessly clean. The driver was well mannered, and he didn't intend to say this. He just blurted out, "You must be a Christian."
Hmm.
And that story always struck me, both in terms of my own, um, let's call it behavior, as well as just being able to recognize excellence in another person. 2 years ago, I got this crazy, goofy idea of going back to school and getting a PhD.
Hmm.
Uh, like, I need a PhD, like I need another hole in my head. I do not need another degree. I'm already, uh, I have more education than my competence will allow. uh, and I'm now into it a year and a half through a major worldwide leading university in England. And every once in a while, and when I was thinking about walking down this path, I thought about your dad a number of times.
Hmm.
Today, he's in his mid 90s, as you said. He's still writing books. He's still active. He's still engaged. He's now using his time to not play golf, although I don't know, maybe he plays golf once in a while, but he's using his time to give back his learning, his intelligence, his knowledge, his wisdom, and he's giving all of that back to the generations that are following him.
Hmm.
And when I was at SBU, I never had any contact with your dad at all, but through his legacy, he's impacting me today. And I just greatly value that example of how to live a life. No matter
Yeah.
how old we are, we're always giving away what we've learned. And he's still active and engaged. And I think that's the way I want to live my life.
I so appreciate that, Dan. When I first started teaching, it was 1994, and I had no business being a professor anyway. I had a little bit of experience, but not a lot. And I'll never forget my dad coming to class, and he was at the time he was the president of Asbury Theological Seminary, and and he took notes, Dan.
Mm.
I'm just like, what in the world can he learn from his son who's in his mid-20s? You know, and so it
Sure.
was just
Yeah.
I really so appreciate your comments about that. And um Dan, would you one of the things I would love to start with is that so people get a chance to know you a little bit, is can you tell us a little bit about I always think about the ecosystems in which we are shaped and formed and they affect us, right? And it's like for me it was industrial organizational psychology was my guild, and I at least as an early adult and going to graduate school, and then I ended up being a
Mhm.
professor and building a program where I'm training other students, and I sometimes you don't even realize the power of that ecosystem and how much that skill set that you learned or that knowledge base shaped your perspective. And
Mhm.
you have even in Sab was giving you the introduction, it's like this there's pieces of process and operations and cost structures and manufacturing all in your in your bio. It takes me back to my operations management classes, and I'm just like, and so there's incredible expertise in that. Would you explain the guild or the ecosystem that formed who Dan Edds is today?
Well, that would take all day, so I'll give you the short version.
Yeah.
So, in my consulting career, although I'd have to say what I'm doing today goes back much further than just when I started a consulting practice. Um, but in the consulting world, I've been a lean practitioner, the Toyota production system. I like to say I was doing lean before anybody ever thought to call it lean.
Yeah.
Um, I've I've got the training and the skill set to build balanced scorecards and design those scorecards. I've done T building, done a lot of process improvement, a lot of process analysis, cost analysis, just a lot of basic financial analysis. Um, Much of my consulting career has been in state and local government, and they'll say, "What is this service that we're providing? What does it actually cost?" And most of the time, when I do the calculations and run the numbers and review the processes and the activities, I come back and say, "Here's your number," and they say, "Didn't really want to know that." Uh, but all of that leads up to what I'm doing today, which is looking at leadership and culture.
Huh.
Because, and I'll just use lean as an example. A lot of organizations will say, "Yeah, we do lean. We do the Toyota, production system. We do continuous improvement." And then when you look at them, they're not.
Mm,
They're using those techniques as a one-off. Go fix this thing. And what they either forget or don't realize is that for basically all of those tools to work, you have to bring with them a way of doing leadership, not just the CEO level, but all the way down. Lean especially comes with it, if anybody wants to read the literature about it, with a whole way of doing management and leadership. Comes with a set of values, comes with a set of leadership processes. So we can't divorce those process tools from the way we do management and leadership. And now I'm getting into my preaching mode, so I better be
well,
quiet.
I'm gonna keep you going if I can. Let me give a little bit of context for what Dan's just describing that is so important to hear. Um, if you look at the decades of research on leadership effectiveness and our in even just development and understanding what leadership is about, one common theme that emerges is exactly what Dan's describing, and it's that you're describing that the focus. I mean, it's just over and over again in the literature, right? It's this emphasis on I have to show care and compassion and see people, these human beings. That's one part of it, and there's all kinds of. In fact, in some of the original research, it was called consideration. There was research out of Ohio State and University of Michigan. And I actually did, and we'll drop this into the show notes, where we did a podcast where I told the story through a parable. And it's all the leadership theorists all the way through history going to a house party together. And so I introduced them over the decades. They're showing up at this decades long house party. At the end of it, Peter Drucker pops into the room. So and I don't know, Dan, if you've heard that, but it's a great example of that. So let me come full circle to your comment. And then I want to continue this. Is that these two sides? So this consideration piece, but it's also the necessity for paying attention to operational things and task structures and so on. And what people don't often realize, I think, especially in our current narrative, is there's so much focus on compassion and care and empathy. That's very much a thematic thing in culture right now. But we can't lose track of the reality that part of that ability to care also comes in clear structures and processes and systems. So I know I'm saying what you're gonna. I want you to can you go a little further, because I'm so curious about how you arrive, like your foundation in those systemic ways, a systems way of thinking about things, and then saying, and there's this human part. Will you say more about that?
Let me give you one of my favorite example. And really the disconnect between the human part and the
Mm,
systems part.
here we go. This is good.
It was maybe 2012, 13, and it's actually one of the events or conversations that got me moving into the direction where I'm at right now. Wasn't the only one, but it was probably, at least from a visual standpoint, it's one of the most striking. I had been asked to help a division within a state department of motor vehicles. And, we're 2, 3 years out of the Great Recession, and they had been just hammered through the recession. They had massive layoffs. They had had such a intellectual brain drain that they didn't even know what their processes were. They were a funding agency. They didn't even understand or know the regulations of what they were regulating. They had lost so much intellectual capital just through layoffs and early retirements.
Mm,
And basically they said, can you go in and just help them improve their processes so they can go home on time and not have to work on weekends? That was quite
right.
literally what the intent was. So at the end of 4 days, we had two, and I must say, all honesty, gorgeous value stream maps up on displayed on a wall. And I gotta say, they were works of art. They were worthy to hang, in the Seattle Art Museum. We also had completed what was called a spaghetti diagram, which tracks a flow of paper through the office.
Huh.
And we discovered that every invoice that they paid, and since they're a funding agency, they paid a lot of invoices. Everyone had to go past the financial manager's desk upwards of 7 times before it was ever processed. So, and at the end of 4 days, we had done the analysis. We had developed 3 or 4 really simple projects to improve their processes, not a one of which would have required a special appropriation of funds from the governor. Didn't require any supervision. They could have done all of that internally themselves. And there was a good bit of enthusiasm. They were feeling good about themselves. Some of the times the conversation was intense. There was times when people actually had to get up out of the room and leave and then come back when they got their composure. And we were just breaking up, and I watched one of their senior managers, who probably is 6'2", 6'3", weighed 250 pounds, I suppose, big guy, walk up to the manager who had brought me into the project,
Mm,
picks him up by the lapels of his sport coat. So he's quite literally on his tiptoes and starts shaking him. Not violent enough that it could trigger, a jail cell, but violent enough to get the point across. And quite literally, he shook him and he says, if you don't do something with this, don't ever ask me to help you again. And it was just with that same kind of intensity.
Mm.
And I'm like 5 feet away from him. I'm thinking, this is pretty intense. So out of respect to the senior executives, the executive leadership team of the department, we went to them. We made a special presentation on what we did. Um, they were thrilled, couldn't have been happier. For one primary reason, the governor, who they reported to, had run on a platform of more efficient government and actually had said, we are going to use lean as the way of getting there.
Mm.
And so they were thrilled because they could now go to the governor and say, we're practicing lean. Makes them look good.
Mm-hmm.
However, something happened as we were walking out the door. I didn't know, I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what had happened.
Mm.
As we were getting ready to leave, they said, oh, by the way, could you keep so and so who's not here today appraised of your progress? And like I said, I knew something had happened, but I couldn't really tell what. But it was like you take a pin to a balloon, the energy just dissipates. And it wasn't until about 6 months later, I was having lunch with the manager who had brought me into it. And I said, what happened? And he said, that was a statement that we don't trust you.
Mm.
We don't trust you to do that job. We don't really think that you can do it on your own. We don't have the confidence in you. So you really need this other director to oversee and hold you accountable. They did make a few changes on the periphery, but nothing like the opportunities that they had. But in my mind, what was almost egregious was that they deprived their team, their staff, the thrill of success and victory. They deprived their people of that opportunity of making a change, seeing the benefit of it, and then being able to celebrate that improvement. Now, the reality was none of those directors or leaders or managers were bad, evil people. They all had the right credentials, they all had the right education, but they were just as involved in a bad system as everybody else,
Mm.
because in their ecosystem, if you will, their value, their worth as both human beings and as state workers was based on their relationship to the governor. The
Mm.
closer they were, the better they were. They didn't have the mindset of developing value in their customers, let alone their people.
Mm.
And so they were just as much a victim of a bad system as the people that were reporting to them.
So for our listeners, when they're hearing you talk about the guy coming up and grabbing him by the lapels, that's a pretty emotional moment. And most people are like, that could not happen today. What I would love people to do is maybe to invite you to see past that and I want to ask you this question, Dan. What was he feeling that would cause him to respond in that way?
Well, you spend 3 or 4 days with people in that environment, and I have never come away with uh, an engagement like this without having seen this. When people see the work that they do visually displayed on a wall, and in many cases, it's almost heroic work that they do every day just to get their job done.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the almost the sense of awe of like, wow, this is what we do. This is what we accomplish. And you see sort of that visual process flow of getting them to achieving their mission. There's a sense of pride and accomplishment in that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got to say, I've never not seen that to some extent. But when that guy grabbed my friend by the lapels of a sport coat, that energy, that passion for their work was simply coming out. I have a fundamental belief that 99.9% of everybody working in any job today, they are begging, dying, passionate about working for an organization that they can be proud of.
Hmm.
They desperately want to be proud of the organization that they work for, the organization where they spend 8 hours a day. They want to work for a championship caliber organization, and they will sacrifice their own time with their families. They will sacrifice, in many ways, almost their own career to help that organization achieve a championship caliber performance, just so they can feel proud of who they work for.
Yeah. It's it's such an interesting representation of what so many people I think feel
Mhm.
without the physical manifestation of it that they can't make. And I think about how, you know, the frustrations that we feel and that tear us apart sometimes. Like there's such destructive forces within us that affect our not only our performance but our well-being, that so often don't get a chance to even get out. It's so interesting. So I wanted to kind of continue this conversation to talk a little bit about culture and trust for just a moment. So often there's this and by the way, in Dan, it was so to be on that list with you recently. Dan and I both were on this list of these top culture gurus, and I had to go look up the definition of a guru, by the way, when I saw it. But it was there's some amazing people on that list doing some work around culture, and I know culture sometimes gets a bad rap, but you know, because it is something that's kind of difficult unless you begin to get into its chemistry, difficult to wrap your hands around, like what is that? But we all know it's powerful. That places, when people come together, they build patterns and norms of the way things work, and the things that are appropriate to say and the things that aren't appropriate to say, and that trust plays a role in that whole thing, along with our systems. The trust begins within the individual. It continues as teams work out their own development together, and then we're working at trust and knowing one another. And then at the organizational level, you've already referenced this, that there are conditions around us that form patterns that affect our trust together, our trust in each other. Would you talk a little bit about that connection between I'm trying to even draw more integration between these operations and systems pieces, doing our job well with the desire in our heart, and trust and culture.
But let me frame it in the starting out with the idea of a system. So we throw that word around a lot, and it's like, what are we talking about? And most of us don't have a clue. A system can be defined in a couple of different ways, but basically all of the definitions comes down to this idea. A system is a set of elements, typically few in number, that are organized in such a way that they produce a purpose. Sometimes my friends in the academic world, we will throw in the idea of emergent properties. And of course, I'm always saying, so what the heck is an emergent property? It's just the idea that the system itself will produce something of value. It will produce a purpose. It will produce a function, or it will produce a property. And so we talk about something like trust. Well, the organizational system itself can produce that experience as an emergent property of the system. Now, that's a long-winded way of saying that patterns of behaviors get built into the organization. And how do how does the system organize those elements? Well, it's one way is those patterns of behaviors. Leaders learn that they can either be rude and obnoxious to employees, and that's fine. That's a pattern of behavior that eventually will trigger the emergence of a property most of us would realize as a toxic work environment. the element of design can also be brought into that system so that rules and patterns of behavior can also produce that sense, that feeling, that experience of safety. So this is the part I want to get your feedback on. So in September, I was doing a week-long certified how to become a chief culture officer in your organization in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, of all places.
Wow.
And amazing experience. It was actually my second time in the year going to the Middle East. And we got talking about one segment of the training was about the employee experience and the value that the organization uh, can be delivering to the employees.
Mm.
And I'll take about a 3-hour
Mm.
segment and shrink it down into 30 seconds. I said, the value that you deliver to your staff and your teams and your employees, it might be trust. There's a lot of research that says trust is critical. It also might be psychological safety, and there's a lot of research around psychological safety as a critical component to that value-driven employee experience. Maybe it's giving your employees the experience of collaboration. Maybe it's giving your employee the experience of wellness and well-being. We can identify research behind all of those different ideas. And what I've been advocating of late is pick one. Just pick one, and you're going to get all the others along with it. Give you an example. Several years ago, I was working with a small hospital, and they had already intentionally chosen and had brought in some training for their managers and leaders of how to extract fear out of the workplace.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
And they actually had a way of measuring fear in the workplace that I thought was brilliant. It was simple. It was very effective. So they were working to develop a fearless workforce, and the logic was pretty simple. In healthcare, patient safety is a big deal. Upwards of 3 million people die every year around the world due to medical error. So they wanted their people to be fearless in spotting an opportunity to improve patient safety and the quality of care. As they began to develop that culture, develop those patterns of behaviors for their leaders and managers to extract fear out of the workplace, guess what came with that? Trust. Now, did it start with trust or did it start with fear? I don't know. Whether you want to create an environment of trust, psychological safety, well-being, any of those ideas, they're different paths to the same destination, which is a transformative place for people to work.
Hmm.
So I would love to get your perspective on that, Rob, because you have studied this
Yeah.
longer than
Yeah.
I have.
Well, it's Dan. By the way, welcome to the wild conversation, as Sabbath said at the beginning, because I love this when we're actually getting a chance to work things out together. Really grateful for this. And there's a meta story in what you described. I think it's really important to note. First of all, you mentioned that choosing that one thing is interesting because in many organizations they don't make a choice, but they actually made a choice not making a choice. So their
Right.
culture is going to have its value statements whether you write them down or not. right? And so but it's gonna be invisible to us, but
Right.
it's gonna be affecting everyone. I love Shine's definition of culture, which has really interesting linkages to what you described. I loved your definition of what a system is. I think people will take notes on that. You should, because these patterns that we put in place, and I love it that you said it comes together for toward a purpose. These patterns that we put together that have some physical pieces and some non-physical pieces. It's why my dad, one of the things that you and I have talked about that he always valued was the threshold into a building. So when you're a college president, you build buildings, science buildings, all kinds of buildings. You raise money for that. And one thing that he valued very deeply was he said that the entry to a building tells you something about the expectations inside that building.
Hmm.
And I think he's right, in some ways. I'm not saying it's the only thing, because Shine would say there's a bunch of it that's underneath the surface that's not physical, that we can't see. Then that maybe 80 to 90% of what the culture is. These are assumptions about behavior. But to your point, like those assumptions are affected by what's on the surface. Coming full circle to your comment, I tend to embrace like these paradoxical realities, and a paradox being it's two competing truths, both of which are true.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
one thing that you mentioned I thought that was interesting, and this may not be the point of your question, but was when you talked about psychological safety related to trust, I have very strong opinions about this. And one of the pieces of this is that we have sometimes an oversimplified message that it's all about that trust is about psychological safety. And it's just not fully true. And I think you and I would just violently agree at the end of this that trust, and even the research would support this, requires, I don't have better words for it, unsafety. Because even,
Say that. Wait a minute. Say that again. Trust
I don't have a better
requires
word. I said
unsafe.
unsafety. And it's so
Okay.
it's
Okay.
like, it's
Explain
like
that.
my wife would say that anything, she used to say this to me, that anything worthwhile is both scary and exciting at the same time.
Sure. Sure.
And so it's like even the process of trust requires truth. It's one of the foundational
Mm.
things that we're finding in our research is that
Right.
we have to have the capacity to be truthful with each other, which
Right.
is by definition requires a little bit of risk. The tension, the paradox between courage and fear.
Sure. Sure.
That courage doesn't even exist without fear.
Mm.
And that what courage and fearlessness looks like for any one of us is different. It's like my friends who are firefighters, like running into a burning building does not scare them, most of them.
Yeah. All right.
What
Right.
scares them is speaking in front of 200 people.
Perfect.
So they would say what courage looks like for one looks different for another. But I guess my whole point
Exactly.
is that I think what's crazy about our research on trust is that it does require a bit of non-safety with this create, and I think this is the leader's challenge, is how do they manage that pressure cooker between making sure people feel safe enough, even vulnerability. The definition of vulnerability is the openness to being hurt.
Sure. Sure.
You know what I mean? And I like breaking things down to that's why I loved your systems definition, is
Yeah.
like that's
Yeah.
what vulnerability is. So when we ask people to be vulnerable, we're asking them to be open to being hurt.
Right.
And
Right.
it's like, and that's a risk. But
Yep.
if we
Yep.
don't take the risk, no one's ever vulnerable.
The challenge of all of that. It's one thing for you and I to be sitting here on Zoom, and we could agree, we could disagree. We may have a rousing argument and
Right?
have fun and have fun doing it. And we could build a tremendous relationship by iron sharpens iron, clashing our ideas, smashing them together. And when we walk away, we're both the beneficiaries of the conversation. We both have learned something. We gained some new insight. That's a great concept if we're talking about an individual leader with a team of 10.
Yeah.
The challenge is to scale that to an
Mm,
organization of 5,000 people.
let's go.
How do you do that?
Yes.
Uh, I think for a CEO of 50 people, yeah, their own personality, their own attitude, their own philosophy, their own values, they can influence creating that kind of vulnerable, collaborative culture where people are free to agree and disagree. And then everybody walks away saying that was a great conversation. Somewhere, I think, around maybe to 250 employees, the ability of the CEO to exercise power and control over creating that kind of a culture starts to diminish. My research is going to be looking at how the best healthcare organizations in the country, how they do leadership. Well, one of the things I'm going to be looking for is how do they scale some of those basic values and ideas about leadership? Or as we were talking about, how do they scale, design those patterns of behavior, and then scale it? So if you've got 5,000 people working in a hospital, there's probably 750-ish leaders and managers. You can't scale that even with some training. I'll give you an example. So a year ago, I was in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. I had done this workshop on high impact leadership, and was at the end of the conference. It was actually the last morning. I'm finishing up my last cup of coffee, and this guy walks up, doesn't ask, "Hi, how are you? May I join you?" He just sits down at the table and says, "I want to ask you a question." Okay. He says, "Are leaders born or are they made?" The age-old question. So I gave him my response, and of course I've said, "So why do you ask?" He said, "I work in the HR department of my organization, which happens to be the healthcare directorate of the Saudi Defense Department. It would be the equivalent of our Veterans Administration. Little workforce of 65,000 people."
Hmm.
And he said, several years ago, we realized that we were not equipped to build new leadership capacity as our um, current leaders are getting ready to transition out and retire. He said, in 12 years, we've gone through 3 vendors to help train and develop our leaders. And he said, we are no more prepared to transition our emerging leaders to, significant leadership roles and positions than we were 12 years ago. That's where you have to have a system in place to scale whatever leadership philosophy you want, whatever patterns of behaviors that you want your leaders to perform and to provide and to model, whatever values, core organizational values that you want your leaders to model, you have to have a system in place to do that.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'd love to get your reaction of, you're in that space of
Yeah.
developing leaders.
Yeah.
How do you scale? I mean, and whole intentional leadership.
Yeah.
How do you get an organization of 5,000 people so you can scale the impact
Yeah.
of that? What would you call it? Leadership, value, philosophy, theory, whatever.
Okay, so you're talking to it. You are preaching you're talking my words like it's my, and it's so Dan, that I'm a person who spent my life building a system for developing leader and people capacity alongside the work. So alongside the operational functioning of an organization. And that's what you just described is core to my heart, so that people, and I think this is, I want to be careful. I don't want to offend all my friends in the learning and development world, but it's where we have not quite hit the mark. And in some cases, like you just described, we completely missed the mark because we think of leader development as separate from the work, first of all. So it's
Mhm.
like people go to a training and then they say, I got to get back to work. Well, what if this
Right.
is the work? I was literally on a session this morning with an organization that launched into our platform, our system this morning. And that was this big statement. That was the big takeaway for them was this is the work.
Mhm.
I'm at work right now because I'm connecting my own development, the things I have to learn to the job I'm trying to get done that has
Right.
been formed around the system of our organization. And so the challenge is this, is that even though people will nod their heads and go, I get it, like where leader development is not a program, It's our system that we will never stop.
Right.
And
Well,
what is the problem is that we like short-term solutions.
yeah.
So we're drawn to the latest book club, a training on emotional intelligence, or one. And I'm not slamming any of these things, but they're
Well,
pieces of a puzzle.
all good.
And we all know that everything in our lives that works has a system behind it.
Right.
We already know that to be true. And so one other thing I wanted to mention, Dan, is this that you hinted at this, and this is the language I use, is that the challenge at scale for most leaders is that because this I wrote a parable about this recently about what happens is you set out on this mission to you think you want to do something when a founder founds a business, for example, and then all of a sudden people start to join them, one partner comes in, they start to build a team, and then suddenly they get to now 100 people are following in this and they're hiring this, and so now we have become an organization, so we have the challenge of scale that you just described. The problem with scale is it introduces another paradox, and the
Mm,
paradox is that if we over systematize, we start to
mm,
treat people like numbers and robots. That happens over
mm,
in your work and my work over and over and over again. So the way, so what I promote that we have to fight for, and we have to fight toward this paradoxical tension between the necessity for systems and the necessity for human beings. So it's that human being and human doing thing that the way I describe that paradox is build systems that breathe. And so this
yeah.
concept of when you think about a system is it has to maintain its connection to the humanity of the people who will use it.
Right.
And you
Right.
have, and if anyone says you build it and you leave it, it just doesn't work because at
No.
scale it will over systematize.
Yeah.
Or what we're seeing in culture right now is we're moving away from systems and we're doing all this corporate speak about compassion without a
Right.
connection to the necessity that we have to connect systemic and operational
Yeah.
systems.
Yeah.
But the best ones are the ones that breathe, they have life in them.
So, let me give you an example of what you just said. Um, th there's some fabulous research. You may even know about it. Happened in the mid 1980s, where a group of researchers were reacting to kind of what you just said. There had been some major systemic breakdowns in organizations that either did or could have produced catastrophic consequences. The near meltdown of 3 Mile Island in the early 1980s, I think, was one of those. They had every process, every system nailed down to operate in near perfect operational capacity.
Mm,
Yet the darn thing nearly melted down and could have killed hundreds of thousands of people. The research behind why that happened basically said these are complex technical systems, accidents happen, too bad. And there's a group of researchers that said, no, we don't think that's true. And so I find this interesting. One of the things they did, they spent several years in various segments of time observing flight operations on nuclear aircraft carrier in the United States Navy. Imagine the Navy has a very clear, very strict command and hierarchy. And yet, what they observed in the flight operations didn't look like strict command and control, but looked more like neural frameworks, neural minds working together for a moment and then dissipating and going on to solve another problem. And one of their examples is that they were watching flight operations at night. They had two jet aircraft waiting to be launched. One of them with the thrust deflector up, which
mm,
was also into the oncoming traffic. If anybody couldn't land, they would run into that flight
mm,
deflector, and the airplane and the pilot would have been disaster. So you
mhm.
got two planes launching, you got five planes coming in for their landing. Of the five, three of them lost hydraulic power. That situation could have been absolutely catastrophic. And yet you've got 20-year-old ensigns working on that flight deck, handling that. And these are 20-year-old kids who don't have the time to run what do I do now, Admiral? They got to make the decision. They have to determine what's best. And they watch 20-year-old kids, many of whom barely graduated from high school, take that emergency situation in stride like it happened every day.
Hmm.
And the only thing that happened was that one plane didn't have the fuel to make another go around and had to head for land, didn't have the fuel to land. They had to ditch the airplanes, but the two pilots ejected out and were perfectly fine. That is a system, I think, as you described it, that breathes. But one of their rules that I thought was fascinating that they had discovered, if you see a problem, you own the problem. You don't pass that problem off to anybody else.
Mhm.
You own it. That very statement says, if you're the admiral, I'm empowering you to deal with this situation the best of your ability, and I will support you in dealing with that problem. You've got an organization with extraordinarily rigid command and control leadership structure, and yet it's allowed to breathe given the complexity of flight operations. It's allowed to breathe, giving people the life, the empowerment, the trust that they need to do their jobs, to do it well, to do it in such a way that at the end of the day or the end of their shift, they feel good about what they did.
Yeah. Let me give you another example on that, and then I have one final question because this is so rich. When I think about that person, that 20-year-old on the flight deck, it's fascinating because when I think about a system that breathes, I also mean that system that starts at the level of scale in the organization that also breathes life into that 20-year-old.
Yeah.
And it's
Yes.
and
Yes.
it's and it's interesting because I can tell that 20-year-old you have the power to make this decision,
Right.
but if they don't know their competence,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they won't believe it. It won't matter. Like if you have the five principles of leadership and we assume that those five things work out the same way in every person, that's not a system
Mm-hmm.
that breathes. That's a
Right.
five-point system that's a system, but it does not breathe. It does not have life for that individual, that 20-year-old. And so
Right.
we know there are certain principles about developing a leader capacity, an example, but the way those principles work themselves out in the life of any individual 20-year-old in that flight looks different because
Mm-hmm.
some of them, for example, this is a breathing system. Some of them will struggle with telling the truth to the person next to them and saying,
Yeah.
this is the problem right now.
Right.
Some of them will have no trouble telling the truth to the person next to them, but they'll struggle to actually listen to that person. By the way, if any of you, if any of those founders or CEOs are listening right now and saying like, okay, I'm getting it. How do I do this? Contact Wild Leaders or Dan Edds, and we'll talk to you more about that, or we'll get you help with someone who can help you with that. So Dan, I want to ask you one other question,
Well, before you
if I
go
could.
there, Rob,
Okay,
and I
okay,
know you're watching the clock. I am too. So one of the other learnings from spending 2 years on nuclear powered aircraft carriers
yeah,
is that they had discovered that an aircraft carrier is really not an aircraft carrier. It's really 5 or 6,000 now men and women in a learning laboratory.
yeah,
The entire structure operations of that aircraft carrier is learning. And everybody from the admiral on down has a learning responsibility, something to learn, and learning to mentor others. And it is a learning system. And that's why they could have 20-year-old kids who barely graduated from high school, um, directing multi-million-dollar high-performance jet aircraft. And when that pilot, who is an officer, gets off that airplane, he does a salute to that kid who helped him get down.
yeah. Yeah. If any of the folks listening want, and this is the thing, if they want to build a learning system, like I want that aircraft carrier, and there are fundamentals you can put in place where you make sure you still see the nuance in the individual, because that's what a true learning environment is. It's not
Mhm.
here's our five principles, we're all going to live by them perfectly. It's that different people are going to struggle with different principles in different ways. So
Sure.
thank you for that. So, your book, Leveraging the Genetics of Leadership, Cracking the Code of Sustainable Team Performance. It's all about designing systems of leadership to capture the full capacity of their workforce to innovate and transform. Will you tell us why you wrote this book?
It really came out of several conversations, like I mentioned with the lean engagement that I did. And I've seen some version of that more times than I care to count. I had finished a project for a division of a state Department of Consumer Affairs. This organization, they process the licenses, state licenses for 450,000 healthcare providers. By their own admission, they were pretty much a mess. They had a phone tree of 10 people who were supposed to be answering phones, for people calling in. How do I get my license? How do I get my license renewed? How long is it going to take? On a good day, they had 6 people operating their phones. Um, and they knew that they were dropping 1,000 calls a day.
Hmm.
So now you got 1,000 people every day who want to rip your head off. Did the work, did the analysis, found the money, how they're going to get it, made a presentation to their advisory council. 2 of the 3 bargaining units that represented these 450,000 people were there. They all signed off on it. They said this was way overdue. Go for it. My last conversation with the deputy director, and she says in almost a whisper that sounded like it was a confessional. I don't even tell my friends where I work anymore. She said, it's just too embarrassing. Flying home that night, I found myself getting angry. Here's a system
Mhm.
that has taken a hardworking, intelligent leader who cares about her people, cared about what they were doing, believed in the mission of the organization. The word that I kept coming up to was there's almost something that's criminal
Mm.
about an organizational system that puts that kind of a meat grinder effect on a person. So they are actually embarrassed to tell their
Mm.
friends where they work.
Mm.
I've heard different versions of that dozens and dozens of times. And so eventually I got thinking, well, how do the best organizations do leadership? We look often at leadership from the standpoint of the leader. Well, the leader has done this, therefore let's model his or her attributes. Or we can look at the leadership through the lens of the organization and how do they do leadership. That's where I began to see that it looks more, the bigger the organization, the more and more it starts to look like a system of the organization that they actually design. And I would probably say they don't always intentionally know that they've designed it, but they've designed it.
Yeah.
And that's why I got writing the book. Along the way, it was and has been a journey I could never have imagined.
That's amazing, Dan. And we'll include a link to that in our show notes for the book, so you can pick that up if that is such an important piece of work. So thank you so much, Sab. I think we have a couple of last questions for Dan.
Uh-oh.
Absolutely, Dan. Thank you for this conversation. And we want the people who are listening or watching to know how can they best connect with you. So we want a direct connection to Daniel Edds. What's the best place for them to find you and the work that you're doing?
I'd probably say the easiest way is through LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Daniel Edds, and you'll find me someplace in there.
Perfect. Daniel Edds, and that's EDDS. If you're just listening and you're not reading any of the other things that we're putting out. Perfect.
Yes,
And Dan,
ADDS.
one last wild question.
Okay.
Are you in a season of accepting yourself or changing yourself?
That's not a one-word answer for sure. I would say it's both in this context. When I started thinking about working on a PhD at my more advanced age, I thought, cool, having a PhD behind my name, that would look kind of cool. Now, what I'm realizing is that it is challenging me at virtually every area of my life. There's
Mm.
no part of my life that it is not impacting. I'd have to say, I'm very much surprisingly in an atmosphere or in a mode of growth and development in ways I
Mm.
certainly never anticipated.
Mm.
That's so inspiring, especially after hearing all of your experiences that you're continuing to step into that space of learning and development.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It has been so rich, so much to take away from. Thank you,
For
Dan
having
and
me.
Dr. McKenna.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sabbath.
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.